final theme I want to look at is real presence. We say that Jesus is really present in the Eucharist. Here's a story I love. It's become pretty well known in recent years. It's about Flannery O'Connor, who I think was the greatest Catholic fiction writer of the 20th century. When she was a very young woman, just commencing her career, she sat down with Mary McCarthy, who was an established New York writer, a former Catholic, and some of McCarthy's friends. And O'Connor said she was so intimidated she never spoke a word during this high-powered literary dinner. But at one point, Mary McCarthy was trying to reach out to the shy O'Connor, knowing she was a Catholic. And she said, I think the Eucharist is something wonderful. It's a very powerful symbol. And the first thing Flannery O'Connor said that night was, in a shaky voice, well, if it's only a symbol, I say to hell with it. And she said, that's about all I could say in regard to the Eucharist. I've always felt that's a wonderful expression of the Catholic difference. When Catholics say Christ is really present in the Eucharist, we know that symbolic language is just not going to do it. It's just not sufficient to the reality that we're talking about. Thomas Aquinas said that Christ's power is present in the other sacraments. He says the Virtus Christi is in baptism, confirmation, orders, etc. But he said in the Eucharist, ipse Christus is present, Christ himself. That's a way of stating the difference, the real presence of Christ. I want to put this theme too now in a broad biblical framework. Let's go back to the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. That's a wonderful chapter. It begins with John's version of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Jesus has performed this great miracle. He's crossed the lake, and now the crowds are after him because they want to see more of this wonderful performance. Jesus chides them. Don't look for perishable bread. See, that's the voice of Yahweh up and down the Bible. Don't seek for the things of the world that won't satisfy you. Rather, he says, seek for that food that does not perish. Then he specifies, I myself am the living bread come down from heaven. The one who eats on my flesh and drinks my blood has life. At this, the crowd balked, and we can easily understand why. This was a proposition that was not only theologically objectionable, it was disgusting. So they say, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Disgusting, especially for Jews. Look throughout the Old Testament. There are all kinds of prohibitions against the eating of flesh with blood. See, blood was the life principle, so you wouldn't eat the blood of an animal. It was unclean. And we hear it prohibited again and again throughout the Old Testament. So now, here's a Jew speaking to his fellow Jews, talking not just about eating an animal's flesh and blood, but proposing his own flesh and blood as food. Well, they were put off, and they balked, they objected. Jesus now is given every opportunity to clarify his speech. Oh, look, I don't mean it literally. I mean this in a symbolic way. But wouldn't that be the perfect moment to clarify what he meant? But instead, he turns up the heat. Instead, he bothers them even further. We have to get a sense of the Greek here to see what's going on. Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. But the word used is not the word we'd expect. The normal Greek word for eating, the way human beings eat, is phagein. What he says is trogein. Trogein is a word that was used to describe the way animals eat. Something like gnaw might get it. Unless you gnaw on the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Then he says, my flesh is real food. My blood is real drink. Just in case they missed what he's driving at. Hard teaching? You bet. And it was hard from the beginning. Oh, those ancient people, they believed anything. Right away, the people balked, and it says, many of them left. These were his disciples, not the 12, but these are many of his followers. They left. He turns to his inner circle, the 12. And I think it's among the most plaintive words in the Bible. Are you going to leave me too? And then Peter speaks up. It's John's version of Peter's confession. Peter speaks up, Lord, where would we go? You have the words of everlasting life. Friends, will the Eucharist, especially the affirmation of the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, be a divisive point? Yes, up and down church history. It was divisive from the beginning. Most of them left. Those who stayed with Peter in his confession, they're the ones who stay in intimacy with Christ. This will be a decisive issue up and down the centuries. Let me fast forward now, many centuries, to the early Middle Ages, the 11th century. There was a great Eucharistic controversy that broke out in the 11th century around this figure of Berengarius of Tours. Berengarius was a monk, a Gallic monk, and like many of the intellectuals of the time, he was intrigued by grammar and by logic. And Berengarius stirred up a great controversy when he raised a logical objection to the doctrine of the real presence. He said, look, there's the body of Christ in heaven, the body of Christ born of the Virgin, raised from the dead, and now in heaven. Then there's this body of Christ we speak of on the Eucharistic altar. Well, that can't just be the same thing, Berengarius said, because that body in heaven doesn't move and change and assume 1,000 different positions on altars all over Christendom. So they have to be different. So when the priest says, hoc est enim corpus meum, this indeed is my body, well, the hoc, must be bread, ordinary bread, which has now become symbolic of the body of Christ in heaven. This ordinary bread has received a new valence, a new symbolic meaning. Okay, pretty straightforward, pretty reasonable, pretty easy to grasp, actually. And that's why Berengarius' approach has been attractive up and down the centuries. Go 5 centuries later, the time of the Protestant Reformation. Read Zwingli and Calvin and many of the reformers. They revived Berengarius' view. You know, the best way to talk about this is to say it's symbolic language. The bread and wine remain bread and wine, but now they're evocative of the body and blood of Christ. Pretty clear, pretty straightforward. But the church balked at the time of Berengarius. It said, no, I know it's easy to understand what you're proposing, but it doesn't reverence the dense realism of John chapter 6. It just doesn't. In fact, you sound like the objectors in John chapter 6, the church said to Berengarius. The church then wrestled for several centuries, wanting to reverence the realism of John 6, but also to recognize the sort of common sense observations of Berengarius. It wasn't until the 13th century, in the work of Thomas Aquinas, that we found, I think, the most adequate way to talk about the Eucharistic mystery.